We begin our investigation of problems in argument with a look at the problems caused by others. In order to be a critical thinker, one has to find a way to look beyond eloquent language and emotional appeals. And in that regard, one important thing to be aware of are fallacies. As noted here in Merriam-Webster's definition, a fallacy is an often plausible argument using false or invalid inference. In simple terms, it's trickery or errors in logic. Shakespeare famously wrote that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. You might also argue that a fallacy by any other name would still be a falsehood, would still smell bad. If you look for definitions of the dozens of identified fallacies online, you'll come up with multiple names for each. It just depends on who is doing the naming. Now, originally, the ancient Greeks used Latin in identifying the fallacies in the sophists' arguments. Remember, detractors argued that the sophists could make one believe black was white with their eloquent arrangement of words and faulty logic. Therefore, the names I use for the most common fallacies to follow may differ from some sources. However, if you learn the concept and to recognize the fallacy, whether it's called bandwagon or ad populum, to the man attack or ad hominem, isn't critical. After all, a rose by any other name. So let's look at these individually, the most common 14 fallacies. First up is hasty generalization. If I argue that the Republican Party is the party of no, I am encouraging you to ignore detail and look at a broad stroke. Looking at the list on this slide, you might note some hasty generalizations that are common. Ad hominem attack is made when an abusive remark is substituted for evidence. If the attack is germane to the issue, these are not fallacious. For example, the faithfulness of a man running for church alderman is relevant. An appeal to pity or emotion is when an ad tries to scare you into buying a product, when a commercial tries to get a donation by showing a tragic little child, when a student argues for a good grade because he's worked so hard for it. Be careful, sometimes the appeal is fallacious. If the appeal is designed to short-circuit questioning and logic, it is a fallacy. The product may not actually do what the ad claims. The money donated may not go directly to a child. The hard work of the student may not have resulted in good work. An appeal to tradition says basically, it has always been this way, so it should not be changed. People often compare things to increase a reader's understanding. However, this can also be fallacious. First, the two things might not be comparable at all. Second, once this poor analogy has been made, the arguer may actually start arguing the comparison rather than the original argument. Here's an example. The first false analogy is comparing Iraq to Vietnam. The second is comparing a terrorist to an insect. Finally, the arguer hopes to prove his point that terrorists should be sought out and killed in the United States rather than hunting them down in Iraq, where American intervention is unwanted, by using the logic that one should not kill a bug in his neighbor's home to prevent it from coming into his own. Now, that's a stretch and definitely a false analogy. Let's look at another common example of a false analogy. Being a football captain and a mayor are two very different roles. You will see false analogies in the coming election. When two things happen simultaneously, we tend to attribute one to the other. A good popular example from recent history is when Jenny McCarthy argued that vaccinations are likely the cause of autism. She based her argument on the fact that autism cases have increased as the number of vaccinations have increased. Well, she may have been right, but the evidence didn't show it yet. I don't know if it has by the time you're watching this. But all that it showed was that one thing followed the other, not that one thing caused the other. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore because of this. Now, when this assumption is made about things that seem likely, we often believe it without questioning. For example, on this slide, an arguer says that television viewing increases violence in youth. Again, these things did happen one after the other, and it seems so likely that one resulted from the other that we may not question it. However, let's flip another slide and you can see the fallacy when we alter the argument just slightly. Both of these arguments imply cause and effect. One is obviously ridiculous, but be wary of the ones that seem plausible but still offer no proof. A straw man is responding only to an extreme or exaggerated representation of the opposing view, or even creating a false position for it. In other words, you create a position of straw so it's easy to knock it down. Williams is specifically stating that he doesn't want to fund attack helicopters. The opposition, however, exaggerates that stand to include all defense projects. Then it argues that straw man position instead of the real one. If someone gives an argument that gives only two alternatives, look carefully at the options. Are there really only two, or are there three, or even more? This is a false dilemma fallacy, sometimes called false choice. The slippery slope fallacy is displayed on this slide. And it says basically one thing will lead to another until we've slid down the slippery slope. This is often used in gun control debates. The National Rifle Association has fought long and hard to keep AK-47s from being banned based on the premise that it is the beginning of the slippery slope toward outlawing all guns. Is this a valid fear? Now, anytime you see a celebrity promoting something, it's likely a false authority. I mean, is George Foreman really an expert on grills? Boxing, yes. Grills, doubtful. Non sequiturs are leaps in logic. The examples shown here are obviously fallacious. Read them. However, like post hoc ergo propter hoc, they sometimes seem so logical that we may not question them, and that's a problem. Two wrongs make a right fallacy. When we justify bad behavior by pointing to other bad behavior, the fallacy is called two wrongs make a right. Now we're going to look at a BBC video of Haig avoiding the question asked repeatedly by Paxman. And this is a fallacy you'll likely see in any election season.
In the current climate of suspicion about politics, your Deputy Chairman, Lord Ashcroft, a man whose peerage you lobbied for, saying that he would become resident in Britain for tax purposes. Can you just tell us, is he resident in Britain for tax purposes now?
I have no reason to think that he's not complied with the commitments that he gave.
That is not the same as an assurance that he is.
It's the truth as I know it.
Have you asked him?
No reason to think that he hasn't complied that he gave, and whenever I've discussed it with him, that is the conclusion that I've come to.
Have you asked him directly?
Yeah, I have discussed it with him, and I've no reason to think that he hasn't complied with.
Did you say to him, are you resident in Britain for tax purposes?
I said to him at the time that, of course, I expected him to fulfil his commitments.
Yeah, have
and
you
I've
asked
no
him-
reason to think that he hasn't.
Have you asked him whether he's complied with the requirements that you said he would comply with?
That I expected him to comply with any requirements, and I would be very surprised if he hadn't done so and hadn't told me
You
about
seem
it.
surprisingly uncurious about
Circular reasoning assumes a proposition to be proved is already proven in the premise. Read this example, and it makes it a little bit clearer. In this example, Sylvia wants reassurance that God exists. Jeremy points to the Bible. When Sylvia wants reassurance that the Bible is accurate, Jeremy points to God, a God he has not yet proven exists except by pointing to the Bible. This circle can go on and on. There are many more fallacies. The important thing to remember is to think. Don't let emotion or eloquent words override your cynicism, and be critical. And if you should actually identify a fallacy by name, all the better, as it will save time in helping you to evaluate at least that part of the argument. And it may clue you in as to whether the source is to be trusted.